I'm not on mute and my video's going. So we'll go ahead and get started here. Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm very excited to have you join us for our webinar titled 12 Documents Required for Exporting. And today we have a true subject matter expert in this field, Mr. David Noah. My name is Jonathan Bricker, and I'm the chair of the Arkansas District Export Council. In my primary role, I work for Regions Bank, located in Rogers, Arkansas, and I'm a commercial relationship manager. I want to begin today by thanking our sponsors, Arkansas Manufacturing Solutions and the Arkansas Workforce Connections. Their sponsorship and their partnership throughout the year are what makes these webinars so successful. I really appreciate you all being here today. For those of you that aren't quite sure who the deck is and what we do, allow me to do a quick introduction. We're a private, nonprofit organization that brings together experienced international business people with potential exporters. We have a ton of experience within our council and across many different sectors. Now, having said that, that doesn't mean that we know the answers to every question, but what we can do is introduce you to someone who does. We're a community of connections within the exporting world, and we want to be your strategic partner and help you grow your bottom line. My hope for the day is that you walk away from this webinar with a little more confidence in your exporting abilities. And if you have any questions throughout the webinar, you don't feel comfortable asking them here, I invite you to reach out to us on our website, exportarkansas.org, and we'll have one of our members reach out to you. Also there, you can sign up for our monthly newsletter, which is chock full of pertinent international news and trade show opportunities. Before we begin, I'd like to ask everyone to please keep themselves muted and raise your hand if you want to ask a question, or just simply put it into the chat. That way we don't have any background noise interrupting our speakers. I'd like to introduce everyone to your moderator today, Mr. Rudy Ortiz. Rudy is the owner of Strategic Business Services, LLC, where he helps companies with a wide variety of international business and exporting needs. He works alongside companies entering new markets and is a U.S. partner of Global Market Entry Consultants, which is a group of experts located in 32 different countries. He has an MBA in international business, is a certified global business professional, and for these reasons, he's the DEC Education Chair. Rudy, thanks so much for putting this on. Real quick, the name of that website, or the website link is exportarkansas.org. Saw a question pop up in the chat. So anyway, with that, Rudy, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Today's topic is really, really important because, if you don't do your paperwork and documentation and follow the regulatory compliance protocols that are required, you can get into some serious problems and lose shipments and all sorts of stuff and not get what you're supposed to get. And it's almost always going to cost you money and time. And so today's speaker, David Noah, as Jonathan indicated, really is an expert in this area, and his company provides software, export and import documentation and compliance software, and that will allow you, especially companies that perhaps don't make a whole lot of shipments per year, to be able to more easily navigate the ability to bring in stuff and to export stuff to clients. And with that, we're going to introduce Mr. David Noah. He's the president of Shipping Solutions, and as I said, they provide software that helps with all of those factors pertaining to importing and exporting and compliance and maintenance. So, David, if you would go ahead and take it away, would really appreciate it.
All right, thank you, Rudy. I'm going to share my screen now so that you can see my slides. Okay, I believe that's up. Let me know if it's not.
It is.
All right, great. So thank you, Rudy, and everyone with the Arkansas Deck for inviting me to speak about 12 documents required for exporting. I appreciate this opportunity. I've had an opportunity to do it in the past, and I appreciate the chance to do it again. As Rudy mentioned, my name is Dave Noah, and I am founder and president of Shipping Solutions. Since 1995, our export documentation and compliance software has helped thousands of successful exporters more efficiently generate accurate export documents and stay compliant with import-export regulations. Now, during the past 30 years, I've had an opportunity to talk with exporters from a variety of industries, sending a plethora of different types of products to scores of different countries. And based on those conversations and feedback from users of our software, I've identified a dozen documents that are commonly used to successfully export your goods. Now, these can vary, of course, depending on what you're shipping and how you're shipping it and where it's going. And you're never going to always need all 12 documents at one time. But this presentation should give you at least a basic understanding of all those common export documents in case you do ever need them. So in a typical export exchange, it usually all starts when you receive an inquiry about one or more of your products. And that inquiry may include a request for a quotation. Now, this inquiry came from a domestic prospect. You probably have a standard quotation form that your company uses. But in an international transaction, your quote would typically be provided in the form of a pro forma invoice. Now, in most cases, the pro forma invoice is the first document you create. It acts like a quote and looks like a commercial invoice. It may be used by your international customer to open a letter of credit, apply for proper import licenses, and determine what else they need to import your goods and make sure you get paid. So a pro forma invoice serves four important purposes. First, it serves as a negotiating tool between you and your international customer. And ideally, it's going to look like what your commercial invoice is eventually going to look like. Second, while it's a voluntary document, it is the preferred method of doing business internationally. It's a good form to provide a pro forma invoice whether or not it's requested. Third, it's a blueprint for the entire export transaction. When it's correctly completed, it contains several key pieces of information that can be used on many of the other export forms I'll be talking about soon. And fourth, it's valid for a specific period of time. Keep in mind that material and manufacturing prices can rise, especially these days. Transportation costs can change, and currency exchange rates can fluctuate. So if you don't include an expiration date on your pro forma invoice, you may end up losing money on your transaction. Now, a pro forma invoice will specify who is the buyer and seller in this transaction and include a detailed description of the goods, including the harmonized system classification of the goods, their price, the term of the sale, and you would typically include one of the 11 current Incoterms, the payment term you'll be using, the delivery details, including how and where the goods will be delivered and how much that will cost, and the currency used in the quote, whether it's in US dollars or some other currency. Now, once you've sent a prospective buyer your pro forma invoice, you've set the sales process in motion. The buyer will have the option to purchase your goods, negotiate the terms, or decline to buy. Now, there are a couple of things I just mentioned that I want to take a moment to talk about before I move on. The first was the harmonized system or HS classification of your goods. I'm sure this isn't new information for you, but just as a reminder, the HS codes are defined by the World Customs Organization and used by most countries of the world as the basis for classifying your goods for import and export. It's a 6-digit code that should be the same in the US as it is in your buyer's country, and it's what is used by your buyer's customs authority to determine the duty rate for your goods. The HS code defined by the World Customs Organization, that six-digit code, is used to create the 10-digit harmonized tariff schedule of the United States for import into the US, and the 10-digit Schedule B code used for exports out of the US. Now, keep in mind that the HS and HTS codes can and do change. Every 5 years, the World Customs Organization releases a revised list of the HS codes, which they have done um, for 2022. And in response to that, every country usually adapts. And so that does not mean that most HTS and Schedule B codes were changed, but some of them do. And it's important to monitor what those changes and updates are so that you are using the proper codes for your products, both on the export and import of the goods. Now, the International Trade Commission will typically release an update to the HTS codes every year, and I would expect that we'll soon see updates to the 2025 edition of the codes for 2026. So you should pay attention and look for these updates. And I would say companies involved in international trade should have as one of their New Year's resolutions uh, the task to review these changes and see how, if and how they apply to your company's products.
David, am I correct in saying that the last four of those 10 digits may not be the same, probably are not the same for another country?
That's correct. Yep, the first six digits should be the same in every country. The last two, four, or six codes, depending, each country has a slightly different way they do it. But the last four digits that the US codes probably are different than what they are in other countries.
Thank you.
Mhm. Now, you also need to make sure you know what your current 10-digit Schedule B code is when you file your electronic export information through the Automated Export System, or AES. So whether you doing the filing or you having an agent like your forwarder file on your behalf, you need to be using the current correct 10-digit code. Now, all you need to know right now is that the pro forma invoice should include the six-digit harmonized system code, as Rudy pointed out, which is the same in every country, because that will be used both by the exporter and the importer. Now, I also mentioned that you should include the term of sale on your pro forma invoice. And for international transactions, that term of sale is typically expressed as one of the 10 Incoterms agreed upon by the International Chamber of Commerce that defines who is responsible for the various steps of the export-import process. Now, this Incoterms 2020 chart of responsibility and transfer of risk that you see on the screen summarizes what functions the seller and the buyer, or the exporter and the importer, is responsible for under each of the terms. Using Incoterms is more complicated than can be summarized in this chart, but I think it provides a good overview of the basic responsibilities of the buyer and seller under each of the different Incoterms. And if you want, you can download a copy of that chart for free from the shippingsolutionssoftware.com website. So once the buyer and seller have agreed upon the terms of the sale and the buyer has accepted the terms of the pro forma invoice, usually they'll do that by submitting a purchase order that the seller accepts. The transaction is ready to proceed. And so when the goods are ready to ship, the seller then issues a commercial invoice. So in addition to listing the amount owed by the buyer to the seller, including when and how payment must be made, the commercial invoice includes several important roles in the export process. It includes um, the destination country requires it before clearing the goods through customs. So they require the commercial invoice. If there is an insurance claim on your shipment, it serves as a key supporting document. Depending on the payment term, the buyer may need the commercial invoice in order to release funds through its bank to the seller. A bank will then examine the commercial invoice before it reimburses funds under a letter of credit or a documentary collection. U.S. export regulations require that exporters retain their commercial invoice for at least 5 years from the date of shipment, and exporters can use it to support foreign credit risk insurance claims. Now, to serve all these purposes, the commercial invoice needs to include important information: the date of the sale and an invoice number, the seller and buyer's name, address, and contact information, the ship to party's name, address, and contact information if that's different from the buyer's address, a detailed description of the merchandise, including but not limited to the name of the items, their 6 digits of HS number, their grade or quality, and their country of origin. Also should include the quantity, price per unit, and total price for each line item, the total value of all the goods, any additional freight and handling fees that are included in the total price of the goods, the currency that you're using, the relevant trade term and location associated with the term, such as FCA, Minneapolis, Minnesota, USA, based on Incoterms Revised 2020, a signature, signer's title and date of signing, and any additional information provided in the terms and conditions on the documents, such as U.S. export control information like an ECCN or USML classification or an EAR 99 indication, any import license requirements if known, any additional certification or statements required by the buyer's country, where the title transfers from the seller to the buyer, and the method of payment that you're using for this sale. Now, as a general rule, most exporters include the 6-digit harmonized system code on their export invoices, and I do think that's a good idea. However, I've heard from some exporters who choose not to include the HS codes on their invoices, and there seems to be two primary reasons they might decide to skip adding those codes to their invoice. First, your foreign customer may ask you to specify a 10 or even 12-digit number for your products. And as I mentioned before, it's the 6-digit HS number published by the World Customs Organization that is used by most countries and should be the same in the US as it is in the importer's country. Beyond that, if they're asking for 10 or 12 digits, those very well could be different. So let's say, for example, that I'm exporting parts for umbrellas. In the United States, those umbrella parts are identified by the HTS number 6603.20.3000. So if I'm exporting these to Germany and I complete the commercial invoice using all 10 digits of that code, the German importer's paperwork may be rejected because in Germany, the correct 10-digit number is 6603.20.0000. A very subtle difference, but an important one. The second reason why you may not want to include the HS code on your commercial invoice is they may ask you to use a code that you don't agree is accurate. Now, I know properly classifying your goods isn't always easy, and you and your customer may interpret the codes differently, or perhaps your customer may want you to use a code that will result in a lower duty rate. In either case, if you believe an HS number is incorrect, but you use it on your export paperwork anyway, you may be committing fraud and potentially putting yourself and your company at risk. In either case, it may be best to simply exclude an HS code from your invoice. But remember, that doesn't mean you can skip including the 10-digit Schedule B code on your electronic export information filing through AES when required. And you should be using the number that you deem is correct. The commercial invoice can also help you stay compliant with U.S. export regulations. If any of the goods in your shipment require an export license or are eligible for an export license exception, you may need to include the destination control statement. This statement is intended to ensure that your buyer understands that the goods in this shipment are intended for the country listed on the invoice, and they shouldn't be diverted to another country. Now, although you may only need to include this statement on the commercial invoice for those items that are controlled under the Export Administration Regulations or the International Traffic in Arms Regulations, you may want to include this statement on all your export invoices. In fact, I know a lot of companies that include this statement on their domestic invoices as well. For example, if you order a new laptop from Dell, their invoice usually includes this statement regardless of where you reside. If your goods somehow end up in Iran, for example, having included the destination control statement on your commercial invoice is another form of proof that your company is doing its due diligence to stay compliant with U.S. export regulations.
David, I want to ask you about the previous slide where we were
Mhm.
talking about the HTS codes and why we may not want to provide the HS code, which is for importing, whereas the HTS code is for the exporting. That is the distinction you were trying to make, right? That if we're exporting, you need to provide the HTS code, but not necessarily the HS importer code. Is that correct?
No, I would say if you're an exporter, you should include the six-digit HS code in most cases on your commercial invoice, except for those two exceptions that I mentioned, where you may disagree with the importer, the buyer's classification of the code. So that six-digit HS code should be included. When you're importing into the United States, you need to list the 10-digit US code, the HTS US code, the Harmonized Tariff Schedule of the United States. Likewise, as an exporter, if the value of your goods is more than $2,500 per HS number, you need to report the 10-digit code in your AES filing. It's part of the electronic export information. So you need to know what the 10-digit US code is. And typically, most companies use the Schedule B code because it's a little easier to classify under the Schedule B codes than the HTS codes. But on an invoice, I would never include the full 10-digit HTS code. I would just include the six-digit HS code.
Thank you, David, for that
Mhm.
clarification.
Yep. Now, there are other versions of an invoice that are specific to certain countries. For example, Canada requires a Canada Customs invoice for imports valued at more than $2,500, unless all the information that is appears on the Canada Customs invoice is on a standard invoice. And so you may just be easier to use a Canada Customs invoice as well as, for example, there are 15 Caribbean community countries, and a buyer in one of those countries may request that you include a CARICOM invoice. So there are other versions of an invoice that you may want to use as well. Now, documenting that your international shipment that process doesn't begin and end with the commercial invoice. A commercial invoice is not a substitute for a packing list, and a packing list is not a substitute for a commercial invoice. The export packing list provides the exporter, the international freight forwarder, and the ultimate consignee with information about your shipment, including the packing details and the marks and numbers noted on the outside of your box. Your freight forwarder will use this packing list to prepare a bill of lading for the international carrier and to prepare export clearance documents, such as the electronic export information filing through AES. Your packing list should itemize the amount and kind of merchandise contained in each individual package that is to be loaded aboard a truck, rail car, vessel, or an aircraft. You will need to refer to your packing list if you have a dispute with the carrier about the measurement and weight of your cargo. You'll need it to file a claim with the carrier or insurance company if your cargo is damaged or lost during transport. And it's used by the customs authority in the country of import to assess security and compliance. Now, if you're getting paid for your export under a letter of credit, you probably will also need to present the packing list along with other export documents to the bank before you'll receive your money. A good packing list provides fairly detailed information about the merchandise, including the buyer and seller information, product description, a reference to the relevant commercial invoice number and/or item numbers, the type of packages, the net and gross weight of each package, stated both in pounds or tons and converted into a metric equivalent, except where the buyer or government regulations require otherwise. The legal measurements expressed in inches and cubic feet and converted to its metric equivalent, except again where the buyer or government regulations require otherwise, and package markings. Remember, a packing list is not the same as a pick list, which is a document that lists the material to be picked for manufacturing or shipping orders. Now, some countries like China and certain Middle Eastern countries require a certificate of origin for your shipments that identify in what country the goods originated. These certificates of origin usually need to be signed by some semi-official organization like a Chamber of Commerce or a country's consulate office. This certificate of origin may be required even if you've included the country of origin information on your commercial invoice. Usually, a Chamber of Commerce will charge you a fee to stamp and sign your certificate or require you to be a member of that chamber. And you'll need to deliver a completed form to the chamber office where they will review it, stamp it, and sign it. A growing number of exporters are utilizing electronic certificates of origin, also known as ECOs. And with an ECO, you can apply for a chamberized certificate of origin online and receive the certificate electronically or overnight by courier. And we have more information about that on the Shipping Solutions software website. In addition to a generic certificate of origin stamped by a chamber, there are also country-specific certificates of origin. The United States currently has signed 14 free trade agreements with 20 different countries in which U.S. goods are eligible for reduced or zero duty rates when imported into those countries. You'll find a list of those free trade agreements on this slide. Some of the free trade agreements, such as the USMCA and CAFTA, include more than just one country besides the U.S. To be eligible for these reduced tariff rates, in most cases, the importer must be able to verify that the goods they are importing qualify under the specific free trade agreement. Now, we don't have time to talk about what those rules of origin and different preference criteria might be, but there are essentially three ways a good qualifies under one of those free trade agreements. First, they are wholly grown or produced in the U.S., like rice grown in Arkansas or hogs raised in Minnesota. Second, the goods are substantially transformed. Or third, the value of the non-originating parts in a good is less than a specific percentage of the total value of the goods. Now, this is a very simplified explanation of how goods qualify under a free trade agreement, but I hope you get my point. You can't say that a good qualifies simply because it comes from the U.S. The rules are more complicated, and the importer must be able to prove their claim. So how do they do that if they didn't produce the goods? Well, they rely on the exporter or producer of the goods to do that for them. And in most cases, they do that by creating a certificate of origin that identifies that the goods do originate in the country that the seller says that they do originate. Now, the United States, Mexico, Canada, or USMCA agreement is the most commonly used free trade agreement in the United States. We don't have time to do a deep dive into the USMCA, but the most important point I'd like to make, and this is true for all free trade agreements and certificates of origin, is that an exporter shouldn't sign the form unless they know it's accurate. I get calls all the time from exporters who just want to know what they should put down in the preference criteria box so they can sign and return a form that the importer told them they need to provide. They've got no idea if their goods actually qualify, and they certainly don't have any documentation to back it up. Now, a company can face significant penalties if they get audited and can't prove that the goods do in fact qualify. That means they need to keep the information they used to make the determination. And so my general advice is if you can't prove that it qualifies, don't provide the form. Now, if you want more information about utilizing free trade agreements at your company, we have a free guide on our website, how to qualify for a free trade agreement, and you can check that and download that for free. Now, the next document is sometimes called a certificate for export or a certificate to foreign governments or a certificate of free sale, but it's evidence that goods such as food items, cosmetics, biologics, or medical devices are legally sold or distributed in the open market freely without restrictions and approved by the appropriate regulatory authorities in the United States. For manufacturers and exporters of pharmaceuticals and food products, the customs authority in the country of import may require a certificate of free sale from the Food and Drug Administration, or also known as the FDA. And for other types of products, they will accept a certificate of free sale issued by a Chamber of Commerce. So you should check with the importer of the goods if they request a certificate of free sale, if it has to be one issued by the FDA. Otherwise, a chamber issue certificate is faster and cheaper to obtain. Now, unlike a certificate of origin, you don't need to provide a certificate of free sale for every shipment. Instead, you may need to provide a certificate of free sale when you first try to import your product into a specific country. You're essentially informing the customs authority in that country that this is a new thing I'm trying to import. Here are my support documents that confirm this product is legal to sell in the country of manufacture. To obtain a certificate of free sale, you need to supply a declaration from the manufacturer on company letterhead that the goods are manufactured in the United States. You must also submit at least 2 copies of invoices issued by your company within the past 12 months showing that you've legally sold these products to 2 different U.S. customers. And again, that's something we can help you with on the Shipping Solutions website if you need help with a certificate of free sale. Now, one of the most important partners in your export transaction is your freight forwarder. A forwarder usually arranges the transport of the goods with the carrier and helps ensure that you've taken care of everything you need to be done for this process to go smoothly. Now, depending on the term of the sale you agreed upon with the buyer, remember that's typically one of the Incoterms that you chose, the freight forwarder may be hired and working for the exporter, or in the case of a routed export transaction, be hired and working for the buyer. So regardless of who hires the forwarder, it's important that you provide them with the information they need to successfully move your goods. And the shipper's letter of instruction, commonly referred to as the SLI, is usually the document you use to facilitate that communication. I often describe the SLI as sort of a cover memo included with all the other export paperwork you generate to tell the forwarder what they need to know about your shipment. And depending on whether the forwarder works for you, this SLI may include a limited power of attorney, giving them authority to act on your behalf for the shipment. In addition, depending on who hired the forwarder, the SLI may grant them permission to file the export information electronically through the automated export system. As I mentioned a little bit ago, most exports valued at more than $2,500 per item must be submitted to customs via AES. Now, that's a very broad explanation of the AES filing requirements, but the point is that you need to keep in mind who's doing the filing and how that filing is going to be done for most of your exports. If the freight forwarder is hired by the buyer, then it's the forwarder acting as an agent for the buyer who typically does that AES filing. Even if you, as the seller, is the one who hires the forwarder, you may still pay them to do the AES filing on your behalf. In either case, even if you aren't doing the AES filing yourself, you are still legally required to provide certain data elements to the forwarder so the filing can be done properly. And the SLI is the document you usually use to do that. Now, as an aside, I strongly believe that the exporter should almost always be the party that does the AES filing, even in a routed export transaction where the buyer is picking the forwarder. And you can negotiate with the buyer to give you permission to do that if you agree to do that. So filing through AES is not that hard to do, and it gives you more control over the process, and it helps ensure that the filing information is correct. However, I do understand that many companies do rely on a forwarder to do the AES filing, so an accurate SLI is very important to include. Now, here's a new document that I don't think I talked about last time I did this presentation for the Arkansas deck. It's the BIS 711 or other end user certificate. Exporters sometimes request that their international customers sign an end use or end user certificate as part of their export compliance procedures. Now, in addition to affirming the intended use and end user of the goods, this certificate may also include applicable legal requirements that apply to the goods, such as if they are subject to the export administration regulations and may not be diverted to a prohibited end user, end use, or destination. In some cases, the end user certificate is required by the Bureau of Industry and Security under the EAR or the Directorate of Defense Trade Controls under the ITAR. Companies may use the BIS 711 form as a standard part of their due diligence process for all their exports, even when it's not legally required by the regulations. Or a company may require it in certain circumstances, such as when they're exporting to higher risk regions of the world, or when they have other potential concerns about a customer. End use and end user certificates can play a critical role in safeguarding our nation's security, ensuring your organization's regulatory compliance, and promoting responsible international trade practices. So at this point, I've talked about the 7 most common forms that an exporter will produce: the pro forma invoice, the commercial invoice, the packing list, certificate of origin, certificate of free sale, a shipper's letter of instruction, and an end user certificate. But remember, that's just typical. There may be other documents you need depending on what, where, and how you're exporting, and how much or how little of the responsibility you want to take on. So I'm going to talk about some of those other documents here more quickly. An inland bill of lading is often the first transportation document created for an export. It can be prepared by the inland carrier, or you can create it yourself. It's a contract of carriage between the shipper and between the shipper of the goods that states where the goods are going. It also serves as your receipt that the goods have been picked up. In an international shipment, the inland bill of lading is not typically consigned to the buyer. Instead, it's consigned to the carrier who will be moving the goods internationally, or if not directly to the carrier, to a forwarder, warehouse, or some other third party who will consign your goods to the carrier when ready. It's important, obviously, to fill out a bill of lading correctly because it determines the shipment date, and payment date is often associated with that shipment date. Financing, too, is often associated with the shipping date, as banks often refer to pre-shipment financing and post-shipment financing. Also, keep in mind that there are more than 10,000 shipping containers that get lost every year. So you'll need a correctly completed bill of lading to help make a claim with the carrier or insurance company. If your goods are being shipped by ocean vessel, you'll need an ocean bill of lading. An ocean bill of lading can serve as both a contract of carriage and a document of title for your cargo. A straight bill of lading is consigned to a specific consignee and is not negotiable. The consignee can take possession of the goods by presenting a signed original bill of lading to the carrier. A negotiable bill of lading is consigned to order or to order of shipper and is signed on the back by the shipper and sent to the bank in the buyer's country. The bank holds on to the original bill of lading until the requirements of a documentary collection or a letter of credit have been satisfied. Agricultural commodities such as soybeans, for example, can be bought or sold during the journey across the ocean, and a negotiable bill of lading helps the exporter do that. If your goods are being shipped on a plane, then an airway bill is required. Now, unlike an ocean bill of lading, an airway bill can never be negotiable. Instead, it's a contract of carriage between the shipper and the carrier. If your products are considered dangerous by either the International Air Transport Association or the International Maritime Organization, you need to include the appropriate dangerous goods forms with your shipment. Shipping dangerous goods or hazardous material can be tricky, and before you do it, the appropriate people at your company need to be trained in the proper packaging, labeling, and documentation of these shipments. Now, that sample document you see on the screen here with the red border is the IATA form, the shipper's declaration for dangerous goods, and is required for air shipments. There is a different version of the form you'll often see with blue borders for ocean shipments. Again, these shipments need to be completed by someone who has been specially trained for dangerous goods shipping. Now, during my discussion of the negotiable ocean bill of lading, I mentioned documentary collections and letters of credit. What you see here on this slide is a bank draft, and that may be used to collect payment for exports under one of those terms. It serves as a guarantee of payment to the recipient, who is typically the exporter, by the issuing bank. In a letter of credit arrangement, the importer's bank issues a letter of credit to the exporter, guaranteeing payment upon the presentation of specified documents and compliance with the terms and conditions of the credit. The letter of credit may specify the use of a bank draft as the method of payment. The exporter is required to draft a document that instructs the paying bank to make payment to the exporter or a nominated party. This bank draft is then presented along with other required documents to the bank specified in the letter of credit. Documentary collections involve the exporter shipping the goods and presenting the shipping documents to their bank. The exporter's bank forwards these documents to the importer's banks with instructions for payment. Similar to a letter of credit, the exporter may use a bank draft as part of the documentary collection process. The bank draft becomes a payment order instructing the importer or the importer's bank to make payment to the exporter upon fulfillment of certain conditions. A bank draft may or may not include a transmittal letter, which includes details of the draft transaction, including the types of additional documents that are included and payment instructions. In both those scenarios, whether through a letter of credit or documentary collection, the use of a bank draft provides a level of assurance to the exporter. The bank draft serves as payment guarantee backed by the issuing bank's commitment to honor the draft upon compliance with the specified terms and conditions. So I've tried to give you a basic understanding of the typical documents you need to create for your export shipments. I often get asked by exporters, particularly new exporters, or those companies that are looking to expand their exports to new markets, how they know what documents they need to produce. And the answer I give is pretty simple. Ask. If you're going to get this right, if you're going to make sure goods clear customs at both borders, arrive in a timely manner, and most importantly, you get paid in full, you can't start thinking about paperwork only once your goods are ready to ship. When you are talking to a prospective customer in a foreign country, your discussion should include which export forms are required and who's going to prepare them. Even if you don't understand what they're looking for, you should ask for more details. If what they're looking for doesn't make sense, don't be afraid to push back until you are satisfied. Talk to your freight forwarder and your bank to find out what documents they think you're going to need for your shipment. Your freight forwarder and your banker are your partners in this enterprise, and they should be forthcoming with advice and assistance. If they aren't helpful, find someone else to work with. Once you've determined what documents you need, make sure you fill them out completely and accurately. It's important that your information is consistent across all your documents. A wrong address on a form could slow a shipment. A discrepancy in how you describe a product may cause problems at the bank. And I shouldn't have to say this, but accuracy includes honesty. I've heard too many examples of companies that have changed the HS classification of their goods on their paperwork at the request of the buyer who is trying to reduce the amount of duty they must pay upon import. Or the buyer will ask to lower the price of the goods on the invoice or mark it as a shipment of samples with no value in order to save money. Now, these requests may seem harmless, but they are fraud, and they can get an export company and the person who signed the fraudulent document in a lot of trouble. Not only could you be fined for these activities, in extreme cases, you could lose your export privileges or even end up in jail. Now, the last thing I want to touch on in this discussion of export documents is document retention. And when I talk about export documents, I'm not just talking about the export forms you include with your shipment that we've discussed today. The regulations say you must also maintain any correspondence, emails, notes from phone calls, etc., that are part of this export transaction. Look at Part 772 of the Export Administration Regulations for a comprehensive list of what types of things you need to keep. As a general rule, export regulations require you maintain export documentation for at least 5 years after a transaction is complete. 5 years is the standard for most agencies that have a hand in exporting, including the Bureau of Industry and Security, the U.S. Census Bureau, U.S. Customs and Border Protection, the State Department's Directorate of Defense Trade Controls, and other agencies. However, the Office of Foreign Asset Control, or OFAC, recently increased its record-keeping requirement to 10 years, which aligns with the changes to their doubling of the statute of limitations for OFAC sanctions program violations. And that was increased from 5 to 10 years. So this new requirement applies to exports to prohibited parties, even if exemptions or general licenses are available that don't require the exporter to apply for a specific license. Keep in mind that OFAC regulations can be broad and may impact exports even if your goods fall under the jurisdiction of BIS or DDTC. Also keep in mind that different federal agencies and departments start the clock on record retention at different points in time. Certain sets of regulations state you must maintain the documents for 5 years from the date of export. Others say 5 years after the export is complete. And still others say you must maintain the documents for 5 years after an export license has expired. So it's your job to know what these caveats are and abide by them. Even once those 5 or 10 years are up, you still may not be able to toss the records. If a government agency requests information pertaining to a particular export shipment before the 5-year period is up, you must continue to keep all the records related to that shipment until you've received written authorization to destroy them. So all the information that I've talked about today can be found in one or more of the hundreds of articles we published on our free international trade blog that we call Passages. If you go to shippingsolutionssoftware.com/blog, you find all the articles organized by topic, and all these blog posts go into greater detail than I can include today. And since we all have different learning styles, we've also started a Shipping Solutions YouTube channel where we publish the same type of information. If you learn better by listening and watching rather than reading, check out our YouTube channel. And if you like it, please subscribe. So in addition to all the who, what, and why information we provide on our website, you can also download free PDF templates of all the forms that I've mentioned today. Just go to shippingsolutionssoftware.com and click on the export forms link at the top of the page. At this
David,
point, I'm happy to answer any questions.
yeah, and before we get to the questions, you and I were talking prior to starting the webinar about this new service that you guys are providing, Global Gateway. Could you tell us just a little bit about that?
Yeah, our global gateway service is it's targeted at companies that are newer to exporting or export volumes a little smaller, and it's a full service export service so that we help with the documentation, compliance, arranging transportation, and making sure complying with import regulations as well. So it's a service that can not only help you. Um, Take control of a complicated process, but maybe also save you a little bit of money on the shipping costs. So that's also on the Shipping Solutions software website under services as well if you want more information about that.
Thank you, David. So I'd like to go to the questions now. The first question that I'm seeing is, if you export a product supplied by a source that is not yourself, does that source supply the certificate of origin?
Well, ideally, they would supply the certificate of origin. They may not be willing to supply the certificate of origin, however, and so in that case, you may ask them to provide you with some kind of documentation on company letterhead that the goods do originate in the US or whatever country they originate in, and then you use that information as a supporting document to apply to the chamber for a certificate of origin that's issued to you.
Very good. The next one is kind of a two-part. Who should be responsible to input the country import HS code? Let's start with that one.
Well, as an exporter, you're responsible for identifying the correct US code for export purposes. And so you need to identify either the 10-digit Schedule B code, or you could also use the HTS codes from the United States. But as the exporter, you need to make sure you've identified the correct code because you'll need that for your AES filing.
Okay. Now, and I may have misread it to you, but actually asking about who should be responsible to input the country import HS code.
Oh, the import HS code?
Yeah, that's correct.
Well, whoever's clearing the goods. So again, that would depend on what Incoterm you're using, who has responsibility for clearing the goods through the customs in the country of import. So if you are selling and shipping the goods under the Incoterm DDP or delivered duty paid, the exporter is responsible for customs clearance, and so they have to enter that number. But I think most U.S. companies um, have the importer, the buyer, take responsibility for clearing goods through customs in their countries. And so, as the importer, then they would be the one who would have to enter it in there.
Okay. And I think the second part, kind of the part B of the original question, I think you may have answered it, but it says, should the seller do it on his commercial invoice, or is this the responsibility of the importer or his appointed customs broker? What is the global norm?
I would say the global norm is to include the 6-digit code on the commercial invoice, and that should be the same in both countries. And then, as Rudy mentioned and I talked about, that additional 4 digits, typically most are 10 digits, that will be different probably in the US and in the country of import. So then on the import side, the importer or their broker would be responsible for identifying the additional 4 digits and getting the full 10 digits. Unless, of course, like I mentioned, you're selling under the Incoterm DDP, and then you are responsible.
Very good. This last question that I'm seeing deals with samples. Is there an expedited or streamlined method of exporting samples to potential customers?
Well, I mean, you still have to fill out paperwork. There, there is some things you can do to mitigate the value of what a sample might be so that the cost of any duties associated with importing that into a country may be eliminated or reduced. But you still have to go through the standard process. And that's, I mean, we have in the past done a full hour webinar just on exporting samples. Again, if you go to the Shipping Solution software website, we have a menu item called Learn, and that's where you'll find the blog, but you'll also find a list of, a list of recordings of the webinars we've done. And if you go to that list of webinars, we have one on exporting samples and repaired goods, and that may be worth watching on that too.
Yeah, and Ms. Heidi was letting us know that there's a method called ATA Carnet for exporting samples. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, so an ATA carnet would typically be used if the goods are then going to be returned to the US or they're
Right,
going to be destroyed. So it could be used for samples, it could be used for merchandise that you're shipping to another country for a trade show.
right.
That way you don't have to pay duties both when you export it to that other country and then when you return it to the US. So that is another option, and we also have a webinar on that as well as articles on our blog that talk about using an ATA carnet. But that's
Yeah,
definitely an option. Yep.
absolutely. And where I've seen that use is just as you specified, you're going to a trade show in France, and you're hauling the equipment and whatnot as part of the displays that you're going to be showing. Obviously, the people in France don't know, the customs people in France don't know if you're actually going to try to sell them there or what, and so they're going to want to apply duties and tariffs and whatever is applicable. And
Yep.
so you try to avoid that by doing the carnet that specifies them as being samples that you're going to bring back, or as you said, perhaps destroy, depending on what's going on. But
Hmm.
that it's not going to be, in essence, exported to France and sold there. So that's where
Right.
that
Although
would be
you
applicable.
can you can use an ATA carnet with the intention of returning them, and then if by chance you do end up selling it, you can make an amendment and pay for the duties at that point
Right,
too.
right.
So.
Well, very good. I think that's all we have time for right now. But Ms. Heidi, if you would put up the slide that indicates the contact information, would really appreciate that.
Sure, just one moment.
And David, once again, thank you. That was really wonderful information and very important information. Obviously, if any of the people who are participating in the this webinar want to contact us, we'll provide that information to you. Also, be aware that we're coming up with a Incoterms specific webinar. I think it's the 21st of December. But in any case, here is the contact information for David and myself and Jonathan and Heidi. If you have questions for any one of us, please feel free to either call us or send us an email at these locations here. And with that, I think we will close it out. David, once again, thank you so much. And to everyone else, have a great day.
Thank you.
Yes.